So long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. That was James Otis Jr., one of the most important leaders of the American Revolution, almost totally forgotten and ignored today. But years before the Declaration of Independence, he helped lay the intellectual foundation for the entire revolution, based on natural rights, property rights, resistance to tyranny, and so much more. And today on this episode, to commemorate his birthday, February 5th, 1725, we're going to explore 5 fundamental principles that James Otis Jr. taught us, principles that we ignore at our own peril. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. Let's kick it off with the first of these principles. James Otis Jr., he grounded all of his views in natural law and natural rights. And he put it like this: there can be no prescription old enough to supersede the law of nature and the grant of God Almighty, who has given to all men a natural right to be free. Natural right to be free. This principle, that rights exist before government, they're not granted by government, it comes straight from John Locke, and of course, Otis had cited him in some of his works. Here from 2 treatises, The Natural Liberty, wrote Locke, of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. Now, Otis explained that this particular principle from Locke, this was the basis of free and independent states. He said, this is the liberty of independent states. This is the liberty of every man out of society and who has a mind to live so, which liberty is only abridged in certain instances, not lost to those who are born in or voluntarily enter into society. This gift of God cannot be annihilated. Now, of course, and unfortunately today, a lot of people assume that when these old revolutionaries used phrases like the natural liberty of man, they were actually intentionally excluding women, but definitely not James Otis Jr., who wrote it like this: are not women born as free as men? Would it not be infamous to assert that the ladies are all slaves by nature? And the answer is yes to both. They are born as free as men, and it would be infamous to assert that they aren't free and they're just slaves because of their nature. And the same goes for this modern assumption that all the old revolutionaries supported slavery and they were excluding people based on the color of their skin. But again, not James Otis Jr. He wrote that the colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. And he even cited a passage from Montesquieu in his Spirit of Laws in 1748, his critique of slavery, warning that the practice could drag America and Europe into all kinds of terrible things, barbarism and more. And here's how he put it: no better reasons can be given for enslaving those of any color than such as Baron Montesquieu is humorously given as the foundation of that cruel slavery exercised over the poor Ethiopians, which threatens one day to reduce both Europe and America to the ignorance and barbarity of the darkest ages. Total opponent of that horrible system right here from James Otis Jr. He said, nothing better can be said in favor of a trade that is the most shocking violation of the law of nature. So number one, everything's based in natural law and natural rights. And number 2 is property rights, the right to control your own property, your own self, your own home, your possession, your labor, all of that to Otis was inseparable from our natural rights, from our freedom itself. Here's one of the most famous ones, so you might be familiar with part of this phrase or this quote. He said, one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, And whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. Now, mind you, this view in support of property rights, this wasn't about just protection from thieves and robbers. It was about protection from, well, thieves and robbers, government abuse. He said, now can there be any liberty where property is taken away without consent? Property rights has to go hand in hand with consent, because if you own something and someone wants to take it and you say no, then you don't really have property rights, or you're not, well, exercising them in practice. Here's how he put it in The Rights of the British Colonies, Asserted and Proved, all the way back to 1763. No man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. Now, and if a government could simply take property without consent, what's left? For James Otis Jr., not much. He said, for what one civil right is worth a rush? After a man's property is subject to be taken from him at pleasure without his consent. If a man is not his own assessor in person or by deputy, his liberty is gone or lays entirely at the mercy of others. Now, importantly, to tie this kind of together, if a government has no limits, there really aren't any property rights. Your natural rights are always going to be violated. If people in power can make up law as they decide to, as they go, however they want, whenever they want, then no rights, natural or otherwise, are actually safe. And so James Otis Jr. believed and reiterated many times that a constitution, and of course he was talking about the unwritten British system at the time, a constitution must be fixed. The rules for government must be fixed, not subject just to the whims of people with power. And here he is writing, along with Samuel Adams, in the Massachusetts Circular Letter of 1768, in all free states, the Constitution is fixed. That means the rules for government are very straightforward. It can't just kind of bounce around based on who's in charge. Now, of course, if the people create that constitution and the people make those rules and the people change those rules, well, then that's a new set of fixed rules for government, but that's a different discussion. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. And he continued, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. So it cannot go beyond the limits of the Constitution. Otherwise, that destroys the entire system. And that's why strict adherence to the Constitution, or demanding it, requiring it, is really the only way a people can stay free. Anything else outside of that is arbitrary power. And he described arbitrary power. He said arbitrary, which in plain English means no more than do as one pleases. So anything less than a government bound by clear, restrictive constitutional limits was nothing but arbitrary power. This was one of the so-called grievances, the injuries and usurpations, the abuses in the Declaration of Independence was also arbitrary power. And again, that's why strict adherence to the Constitution is what it is, what it means to set up a free society. And here's how he described it. He said, these are their bounds by which God and nature are fixed. Hitherto have they a right to come and no further. Sometimes it's a little tough to read this older stuff, but basically you start with the laws of nature, and then the people empower government to do things through a constitution, and those are the fixed rules for government. There are 4 points that Otis made here. 1, to govern by stated laws. 2, those laws should have no other end ultimately but the good of the people. Now, if you have the stated laws and a politician or a person with power says, well, this would be really good for the people to do, but it's outside the limits of the Constitution, that isn't for the good of the people, according to people like James Otis. 3, taxes are not to be laid on the people. I wish he would have ended it there. To be honest with you, that would have been perfect. Taxes are not to be laid on the people, he said, but by their consent, in person or by deputation. This is the early version of no taxation without representation, the slogan from the American Revolution. And he said their whole power is not transferable. He said these are the first principles of law and justice and the great barriers of a free state and of the British Constitution in particular. I ask, I want no more. And for James Otis Jr., any act, even a small act, anything outside the limits of the Constitution was no law at all. And in 1761, in his great multi-hour speech against the writs of assistance, which really gave him the label of the father of the Fourth Amendment, the founding father of the Fourth Amendment, he said, an act against the Constitution is void. His thunderous speech was so important that John Adams later described it by saying, then and there the child independence was born. And part of the child independence were these essential principles from James Otis Jr. An act against the Constitution is void. It's no law at all. And principle number 4 is really important as well. Actually, I want to quick point out that over in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, we publish a blog post for every single episode. And if you're wondering where I'm sourcing all these documents and quotes from James Otis Jr., most of them come from the collected political writings of James Otis Jr., which is available for free, both online and as a PDF download from Liberty Fund. That'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. But we also have a few other reference links that'll be included there as well. Plus, you'll also be able to find all the various platforms that we're on, both video and audio only podcasts. That way, if you want to pick us up on a different platform or you want to recommend one to us that maybe we're missing from, that way you can check that out there as well. That'll be published again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But let's get back to it. Essential principle number 4 from James Otis Jr. is submission and compliance with arbitrary power guarantees tyranny. So if we base things on natural rights and property rights, and then they create a constitution that creates a constitution for government with various limits, they don't always respect those things, so that's a different discussion. But government goes beyond those limits. It's arbitrary power. What do you do about it? Do you just sit by and wait for government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do in the first place? And meanwhile, or you just try to convince them to stop, and while you're trying to convince them, you continue complying with it? Well, James Otis Jr. said, absolutely not. Only following laws within the bounds of the Constitution is how he characterized a free people. A free people does not submit to arbitrary measures, period. And that's how he described it in 1767. To obey such laws and submit to such taxations only as we consent to is the peculiar happiness of British subjects and the invaluable privilege of Englishmen. This is our felicity, and this is what characterizes us, a free people. So to James Otis Jr., if you're going to have rules for government, you're not free if you are complying with stuff that government isn't authorized to do in the Constitution. You are only free when people obey those laws and submit to those taxations as they consented to in their Constitution. And Otis had some pretty harsh words for those who taught the opposite, especially something called passive obedience. He said, he that would palm the doctrine of unlimited passive obedience and non-resistance upon mankind is not only a fool and a knave, but a rebel against common sense, as well as the laws of God of nature and his country. Man, that one is worth repeating. One more time. Let me hammer that one out one more time. He that would palm the doctrine of unlimited passive obedience and non-resistance upon mankind is not only a fool and a knave, but a rebel against common sense, as well as the laws of God of nature and his country. So Otis did not look too kindly upon people who would say, you just got to comply with that, and we'll petition them to stop doing the things that they weren't supposed to do, and hopefully they'll just come to their senses. But in the meanwhile, don't resist them, don't refuse to comply, none of that stuff. But that's not that's not the definition of a free people, not even close. And that means point number 5 is really essential. You have to resist arbitrary power early and often. Resistance is essential. And James Otis Jr. put it like this: it is of the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and rights. He understood, like so many others in the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, that once government does one thing beyond the limits that it's authorized to do, that sets up what his friend John Dickinson called the detestable precedent. And government will always try to build upon the precedents it has, not just precedents by courts, but precedents in action. So once they're allowed to do one thing, they'll build upon it and build upon it and build upon it. And he had said it in another one, this is just off the top of my head, but he basically said a free government never descends. Now that may be an oxymoron, but we'll go with it. A free government has never descended into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years, because he recognized this essential principle. And that's why I said it's of the utmost consequence to oppose the least infraction of our charter and rights. Many decades later, 1791, Thomas Jefferson had a very similar principle where he said to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution was basically giving them a boundless field of power, because if they can go beyond the limit on this issue, they can go beyond the limits on any issue. It just becomes a matter of will and power and possibly popularity. So resistance is essential, especially early on. And he also continued with another phrase, a Latin phrase that was, it's obsta principiis, is I believe how you say it. He said, this is a maxim never to be forgot. If we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late. And I think this final warning, the one that I started out with, is really, really essential. It really ties it all together. So long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. So to sum it up, these are these 5 essential principles, at least in my view, from James Otis Jr., this essential, forgotten leader of the American Revolution. First of all, natural rights. Natural rights, that's the foundation of everything else. 2, there is no liberty without property rights and consent. These are absolutely key to our freedom. 3, government has to have strict limits. Whether you give them a lot of power or a little power, preferably the less the better, of course, whatever power they have, it has to have limits that cannot be crossed. Anything else is arbitrary power, the definition of a tyranny. Number 4, submission and compliance with arbitrary power guarantees tyranny, whether in the short run, the long run, or both. And number 5, to remain or become free, resistance must happen early and often. Again, number 5, to remain or become free, resistance must happen early and often. There is absolutely nothing whatsoever that helps us get this kind of essential foundational principle out to more and more people, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way again. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options, or you can make a one-time gift over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. This helps us more than you can imagine. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC, but as little as $2 a month will help us continue doing this work and expanding it into the future. No pressure on that, but I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. There's also a number of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word. Reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. The more watch time, more percentage watch time you have of a video on a mainstream platform like YouTube, even over 100% watch time. That means watching it more than once. That will help out a lot. Comments in the archive, subscribe, get notifications, hit the like button, all that. All the things you can do to interact with the various platforms on our show is very, very helpful. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to helping us out today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.